And as you can see, it's a very busy time for journalists around the world as more and more cases of the coronavirus are reported. More media conferences are held, and of course, there's a greater demand for news from an often bewildered and panicked public. How should media companies be protecting journalists, or should they at all? This is the question that we ask. Executive Director of SANEF, Kate Skinner, joins us now. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for joining us, Kate. Is this a question that we should even be asking, given the fact that this is the way that it works in the media world?
Well, I think that we absolutely have to be asking the question, and we have to be putting measures in place around the safety of journalists. So I think, of course, journalists have got to be out there, they've got to be... This is one of the most important stories, but that doesn't mean that we, as media houses, shouldn't be ensuring that journalists are careful. For instance, so that have compromised immunity systems shouldn't be sent, for instance, to places where they could in fact be infected. So you have to choose the people that go on assignment very carefully. You have to look at issues around, the protective gear that they wear, all of those kinds of things. And I think absolutely we as media houses need to be looking at those issues.
And Kate, how do you do that without facing charges of being discriminatory? As you say, you would take people who you would deem more vulnerable to work perhaps in less exposed areas or do less challenging or difficult work. But what if those people feel that they're still able to do the work and they still want to do that which could possibly expose them?
So, obviously that's a negotiation within the media house, and it's very important that, that staff are consulted. But I do think it's important to look at the fact that if someone is vulnerable, it doesn't make sense for them to go maybe to the kind of epicenter of where the infections actually are. So, of course, there are many stories that can be covered where you speak to experts in the field, medical experts, etc., where you wouldn't be exposed to that level of risk. And maybe just to say that there has been some excellent work done by the Committee to Protect Journalists in New York around what media houses should do in terms of protecting their journalists. So, in fact, some really good work is out there for South African media houses to have a look at. Appropriate.
So then what should we be following as of those standards set in New York?
So for instance, a lot of, and I think a lot of the media houses are doing this anyway in South Africa, is that, anybody that doesn't need to be in the office should be working from home. So I think that's one of the big things. Another issue is that, for instance, if you are journalists to an area where they could potentially be infected, what you need to do is plan that assignment very carefully. You need to send journalists that are fully aware of what they're going to be doing, what the risks are. You need to make sure they have protective gear. If masks are required, that masks are given, but also that they, journalists understand exactly how to wear masks, because apparently, you can really mess it up and in fact infect yourself more by wearing a mask incorrectly. And also, of course, post the assignment, it's very important to make sure that those journalists are, monitoring their health. If there's any problems, they're actually seeing that they might be infected, that they then isolate. So it's a lot of planning for the actual, when they're on the assignment, and of course post as well.
There's some also very insidious threats, should I say, to journalists. I see that depending on from whence you look at the story, the fact that journalists in China are possibly facing the threat from the government to report more positive news. Is that something in terms of the dangers that journalists could face while covering the coronavirus, the narrative that they're trying to portray? Yes, absolutely. Because I think what we as journalists is making sure that we're covering this, a pandemic in the most kind of thoughtful, 360-degree way. And if we're being stopped from doing that, that is a huge problem. And you're right that some journalists will be in areas where governments don't want them to cover everything, and be as critical as they should be. So I think that's also something that, media houses, the editors need to make sure that when they send people on assignment, that if there are going to be problems, that those political
medical issues are also taken into consideration, because you're quite right, that is also a major threat.
But there's also the other thing that I'd imagine that journalists themselves have to look at in terms of how we cover it, being responsible. The health department in South Africa lamenting the fact that some or should I say establishments that were going to house people who are going to be in self-isolation or quarantined are being harassed. So it's the use of responsible language or responsible behavior.
I think that that's absolutely critical. So it's very much around the issues of not creating panic, of, really finding credible sources, also making sure that you're not stigmatizing people. All of those issues around responsible journalism, I think, all the time, journalists should be aware of, but, given this critical that they are now, you're correct.
Thank you so much for speaking to us, Kate Skinner of SANEF.